Well, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.
I know that I and so many other people really loved your book. It's funny because it feels like reading books like this it's familiar to me because it's so adjacent to the work that I do, but I read the book and was taking notes on like these are quotes that I like, these are examples that I want to be using with clients, and so I really appreciate your willingness to talk to us. And so some people will be joining live, other people will be tuning in um, to the recording, but people have sent in questions, and so it
Hi,
is.
Turbo. I do live in Kansas City. I left, I came back, I left, I came. I don't know who Turbo 1823 is, but yes.
Um, so I guess we will get started, and people can join um, as as they're able to. And so today, for this month's book club, we are speaking with Britt Frank, who is a licensed neuropsychotherapist and the author of the terrific book The Science of Stuck. And what I love so much about this book is that everything you say is so digestible, that you are backing up what you're saying with both evidence and science and personal stories and client stories, but it all feels so digestible and so accessible. And I love how at the end of each chapter you give the do's and don'ts, because I think that often with books like this, it's easy to feel like there's so much work to be done. Where do I even start? And you make everything so actionable. And, I really appreciate that.
Thank you. It's the book I wish I had had earlier on, like something that was academically based and evidence-based and informed, but in a way that made sense to my brain. So I turned these models and frameworks that I've learned into cartoons and pop culture anecdotes, because that's just how I learn. So I thought it might be useful for other people too.
Yeah. And I think that this book club has been going on for 18 months or so now, and this is the type of book that is the reason that I started the book club, because
Yay.
initially I had kind of created a blanket offer and feeling really frustrated by how hard it is for people to access mental health services to help connect people to therapists around the country. And so many people would message me and say, therapy sounds great, I'm not there yet. What's a book I can read? And
Mm-hmm.
I think that books like yours not only open up people to the idea of therapy necessarily, but like just help people see that change is possible and leave people feeling like there's hope.
Thank you so much. That was my intention. I'm not that altruistic. People are like, did you get into this helping profession to help people? And I'm like, no, I got into this profession because I was a hot mess of a human. I worked in the corporate world, and then learning this made my life better. Now that's all I want
Yeah.
to talk about. So
And I think too that your transparency about that makes it very relatable, that it's not, didactic and like I'm the expert and I'm speaking to you just as a clinician, that you have the perfect mixture of personal experience and obviously the clinical experience. So I have handpicked what I hope is a variety of questions and consolidated some questions that were similar into um, one, but I will jump into
great,
them.
let's do this.
So you talk about how anxiety is the result of ignoring yourself. Um, I think that it's an important reminder that anxiety is information. That's something that I tell people all the time. But I think for a lot of people, they feel like that's helpful to know, but I don't know how to get in touch with what it is that I want or what it is that I need. What what are basic tips that you can give people for, if they're feeling the anxiety instead of being frustrated with themselves for being anxious? What are the first steps to getting in touch to what it really is that they want or need?
Yeah. And I have endless compassion on the dilemma, right? Because not everyone is, I personally was in denial and fully consciously ignoring myself. But there are plenty of people, many, if not all of my clients, who are there genuinely wanting to know what is going on inside my head. I want to know, I'm willing to know, I don't know where to start. And the starting place is counterintuitive. but you cannot come to a conscious awareness of what you think or feel or want while your brain is on fire. So what we need to do in first order of business is not why do I feel this way, which is everyone's first question. And that was mine too. I mean, I became a therapist because I was obsessed with the why.
Yeah.
And the metaphor I always use is, like, if the building that you're in caught fire, I'm not going to sit here and ask you, how are you feeling about it? Or how did it start? Or I wonder what the origin causes are. Those things are important. But when you're feeling anxious, that's not the time to figure out who you are and what you're about. When you're anxious, we got to put the fire out first. And the way to do that is, step one, validate that your brain is on your side. I'm sure you were schooled in this too. These war metaphors that we use. I battle depression and I'm fighting my demons, and all of these war metaphors, it's not just about being a language like gatekeeper, but when you have these war metaphors, your physiology is going to amp up the stress response. So it's not, I'm having an anxiety attack, because then your brain hears I'm attacked, and then it preps you to survive an attack. It's, this is awful. Validate this. I feel like I'm dying. I feel something terrible is happening to me. My brain is on my side. This response is for me. I don't know why I'm feeling it. I don't know what I'm thinking, but right now I have to start with step one, validate the symptom is a signal. And step two, what are my choices right now to dial down my reactivity from a 10 to a 7? That needs to happen before we can introspect and figure out what we're about on the existential human level.
Yeah. And I think that that's so important. And I think too, like, not just in being introspective for oneself, but I think often when people try to lean on others for anxiety, people will try to be the problem solver. And what a lot of people don't understand is, when you're feeling the anxiety, the problem solving is helpful, but maybe an hour from now or a day from now, that sometimes people just need to be able to sit with the anxiety and acknowledge it for what it is before they're even willing to be receptive or able to think about, you know, how to solve the problem.
Exactly. And I've been surfing now twice with dear friends of mine. And when you're getting tossed and you're wiping out, that's not a good time to try to problem solve or strategize or figure out where you could have done things wrong. First order of business is get to the surface, get some oxygen. But we, many of us, myself included, were taught that there's something wrong with you, so you have to stop it. And it's like, anxiety is not a sign of character weakness or lack of strength or some sort of more, and I'm not minimizing the severity of the symptom, and that certainly it can lead to other problems. But the symptom itself is not the problem. It's a problem. It's a signal pointing to a problem. And first order of business is not what's it pointing to. First order of business is we got to turn the light off before we're going to get to the part of our brain where all of our logic is housed.
Yeah. One part of your book that I have thought a lot about is you talk about how boundaries without compassion can feel rigid and unkind, but compassion without boundaries is codependency. How do you suggest people know the balance to strike between boundaries and compassion? I assume that you would say that it depends on the situation and depends on the person, but how do people figure out how much compassion do I give versus how many boundaries do I set in this specific situation?
So I really love that question, because it really speaks to this problem of people equating compassion with permission. So compassion is not a co-signing on a behavior, nor is it saying the behavior is acceptable or giving permission. So with that, you can have all of that. You don't have to restrict the flow of compassion whatsoever in order to hold a bound. And so an example of this would be if a loved one is addicted to drugs and they're coming to you for money or food or resources. You don't have to be mean to them. You don't have to cut them out of life. I can, with all the, and again, easier said than done, but with all the compassion in the world, say to that person, I love you and I will never turn my back on you and I will never, ever shun you. And here comes the boundary, I'm not willing to give you money. If you want help getting treatment, I'll help you with that. I'm not willing to pay your phone bill. You can have all of the compassion in the world as long as the boundaries stand in front. But what happens is we equate compassion with permission. If compassion means I need to enable this, and no. If we can uncouple this definition that compassion is a feeling, a boundary is an action, and both can coexist quite peacefully, then we're in better shape.
So I think that that's a really good differentiation. So it's the boundary that more is on a gradient level of what are the boundaries I want and need to set, whereas the compassion can always be there. Is that fair to say?
It is, and every situation, like you said, is nuanced. But if you're trying to figure out what's the right balance between boundaries and compassion, ask yourself, what's the impact of your choices?
Yeah.
Because if you're holding a boundary, you can't control other people. That's the other thing in the zeitgeist now, that somewhere boundary became synonymous with I'm telling you what to do and controlling your actions. And that's not, a boundary is what am I choosing? And so is somebody getting worse because I am helping them to get worse, or is someone getting worse because I'm refusing to help them get worse? And that's a hard one, but it's a really important question to ask. A lot of people feel horribly mean setting boundaries, but that person is not getting worse because you're not enabling them. They're getting worse because reasons, whatever the reasons might be.
And that reminds me, I don't know if you're familiar with Terry Cole's work, who wrote the book, The Boundary Boss. But she talks similar to this about this idea of people who say, I live to make other people happy, that she calls it high functioning codependence, which is very similar to what you're saying here, that you need to set a boundary. You can't just always be trying to give unconditionally to people without knowing what your limits are.
You can, it won't go well. And
Sure.
that's the thing I love that you said about unconditionally. One of, I think, the core beliefs that developmentally we need to leave behind in childhood, this idea of unconditional love in relationships. Now, the feeling of unconditional love is fine, but we can't unconditionally show people love, because that's just not a realistic expectation of adult human relations. I was so mad when my therapist said to me, you realize that unconditional love and unconditional trust is a childhood thing? And I'm like, well, I didn't get that in childhood. She's like, well, then you're not going to get it ever. And that was tough medicine, but it was also incredibly healing, because if we understand that unconditional love and trust is not a realistic expectation in adulthood, then we're going to approach our adult relationships with a different set of what our boundaries could be and what our expectations and needs might look like, versus this, you should just love me unconditionally and I should be able to treat you however I want, and you can just love me without any condition. Like, we should have conditions. That's not unkind. That's human.
Yeah. And I think too, I mean, the part of the book in which you talk about attachment is more like parent-child attachment, but I think what you're saying relates to adult relationship attachment too, and that boundaries are healthy to have that secure attachment in adult relationships as well.
Yeah, not only healthy, but necessary. An adult relationship with no boundaries, I would guess that you're not going to see a whole lot of health.
Yeah. One more question from me before I go completely over to book club members is that I often find that with my clients, people feel stuck in not wanting to let go of a diagnosis. That, a lot of people feel worried about who they'll be without the symptoms that they've experienced for, often decades before seeking help. What are your thoughts on this? And, I know you talk a lot about the disease model that society, has prescribed onto mental health, but what are your thoughts on people feeling stuck of this ambivalence of wanting to get better, but not wanting to let go of a diagnosis or an identity that they've clung on to for so long?
It's so hard. And again, I'm not the gatekeeper of how people conceptualize their So if you're watching and you want to hold on to your diagnosis, you do you. Like, I'm not in the business of telling you can't. But the problem and the reality is that our brains get very accustomed to whatever pattern we find ourselves in. And for me, first it was the pattern of addiction, but then the pattern of recovery. I loved the rhythm of recovery. I loved going to my meetings every day. I loved calling my sponsor. I loved doing my worksheets. But it came to a point where I no longer subscribed to the same ideology that I was hearing in these. And again, I'm not anti-12-step. They saved my life. But it was no longer an identity I was willing to sit and lead with. I am an addict didn't work for me. I subscribed to the multiplicity of mind, where lots of different parts of me do lots of different jobs, one of which uses addiction to cope with undealt with trauma. And so when I started to understand that framework, I found that I chose to leave that world because it no longer fit. And that sucked. And no one talks about the grief associated with healing. We all think healing is great and everything is going to get better. Yes, my life is a lot better now that I don't have an active eating disorder or an active drug addiction or active codependency. But the grief of leaving people behind when we no longer identify with that particular set of challenges. And again, it's not like I'm better or cured or healed. It's just I no longer identify as an addict, and my time I use to stay well, I invest in different activities than I used to. I used to go to meetings all day. It was like first thing in the morning, I'm going to a meeting, and then I'm going to wait until noon and then go to another one. And eventually that didn't work anymore. And I was so surprised and saddened. But grief is a dirty word in our culture, and we're not allowed to grieve the death of people, let alone the loss of unhealthy habits or friends. But grief is one of the most underutilized and necessary pieces of medicine in the healing process.
Yeah. And I think it's a term that people are perhaps too careful to use because they so attribute grief to death of a person and are not willing to label, something as it is. And it goes back to a line you had that I'm going to butcher it because I didn't write it down, but or the past stays present until it's processed.
Nailed it. Yeah.
And I think that that's part of it too, that people need to grieve whatever happened in the past in order to be able to move on from it. And not necessarily even move on from it.
Right. Just to be able to live without spinning, be living it. Like failure to grieve the past keeps us there. It doesn't mean you have to ruminate for all time on whatever the thing is, but we're not taught how to grieve. Were you taught how to grieve? I wasn't. It was never a word I heard growing up.
No. And I think too, one thing I think of a lot, particularly with trauma, is that you don't necessarily move on from trauma, you move on with it. And that it's until you can process what it is that happened, how it impacted you, that you're like, I think there's this expectation that you just get better and everything goes away. And that often, people are complex and it's perhaps unrealistic that things will completely go away. And I think being able to acknowledge that is really important in these types of situations.
Which is one of the reasons I love doing things like this, because I get to, I'm not hiding behind my words. I'm just going to say I wrote the book and I'm a trauma expert, and I still get triggered and I still go to therapy. I still have, moments where I show up super sub-optimized and struggles look different. It's not hard for me to not do drugs now, but that does not mean that I don't have hot mess, ugly crying, snotting on myself kind of days. It happens. So this expectation that we hit a point of wellness where we're no longer triggered is one of the things that keeps us stuck. The goal is not to not feel crappy. The goal is to be able to shift between states faster so we don't get in the same loop.
Yeah. I completely agree with that. This goes back to the first question a little bit, but it's slightly different. Someone wrote in and said, how can I break through ambivalence to decisiveness? I imagine from your book that deep down I do know what I want, but I'm not aware of what this is. The ambivalence makes me feel stuck, particularly in my relationship.
Oof. Yikes. That one's a tough one. The do I stay or do I go question. And I get it. I've been in really dysfunctional relationships that I couldn't let go of. I've been in long-term relationships, and the do I stay or do I go, what do I do about this relationship question is way too big for a brain to try to metabolize. And so I say the same thing to everyone in that situation, regardless of the nuance and the context. Is today the day you're ready to make a decision? Do I stay or do I go? Likely the answer is not today. So great. Don't ask yourself that question again. Only once a day say, is today the day I'm ready to make a decision? If the answer is no, it's no. If the answer is, well, almost kind of, that's also a no. If the answer is yes, or when the answer is yes, you'll know. What do we do in the meantime is the question. And it's, you might be able to decide, do I stay or do I go? But let's say economic insecurity is one of the things keeping you stuck. Then maybe you can say yes to finding out what are your options for making sure you're financially secure enough to leave. Or what are your options if you've been out of the and you need to go back. So what we need to do is not obsess over the big question, but figure out how can we get momentum in different smaller areas to make that big question less big.
Yeah. And it goes to, and I don't know if this is a direct example of this, but the GPS analogy that you give, that you don't have to know necessarily what direction you're going in, or perhaps, to expand on it, how far it is that you're going, but just start moving in the direction, and the GPS will start working.
Yeah. And you have to get into drive for it to start working. Making a wrong turn is not a problem when you have GPS, right? It'll reroute. And so we all want to take the right steps and not make, now I understand things like, do I get a divorce or do I have a child? You can't just undo them. But there are small things, small turns that we can make where if we're starting to pay attention to what's the impact of this choice on me, you're going to be able, once you start paying attention, pretty quickly to know whether this is in alignment with not who you think you should be, but who you actually are. And inner alignments is really helpful when we're making those bigger turns.
Yeah, and I think it's often, I'm curious your thoughts on this. I don't think you talk about it in the book, but maybe I'm just forgetting about it, the shoulds that people live by. Do you talk about this?
It's something I talk about in just daily life. From the 12 steps, don't should on yourself. Okay, shoulds, oughts, and musts from if you've ever done cognitive behavioral therapy. That's key. I don't like should. Should is such a parent-child power differential, not autonomous kind of thing. Like you could change your shoulds to coulds, and right there you've solved half of the equation.
Yeah. I totally agree. Someone else wrote in, and I hope I tried to kind of summarize the question, and I hope I got it right. The question is, how can I excel in my career if I suffer from intense imposter syndrome and anxiety? And then the person wrote about putting up a facade of being confident in her own expertise in her career, while inside not being sure about whether she's doing a good enough job, or feeling like people are being completely honest with her about whether she's doing a good enough job.
Oh, I love that question. So the imposter syndrome thing, we could do a whole thing just on that.
And I know you do talk about it.
So here's the thing, the word syndrome, and again, I'm not a terminology gatekeeper. I am not. Use whatever words you want, but it doesn't matter how we speak to ourselves. This idea that imposter syndrome is a syndrome, it's somehow pathological, takes the humanness out of it. Like, if you're comfortable in every area of your life, then you're probably not challenging yourself in a growth way, which fine if that's your thing. But imposter syndrome is a sign that you're pushing your growing edges, and that's a good thing. Again, no one goes to the gym and expects it to feel comfortable, yet somehow when we're growing in our career, or we're growing in whatever the thing is we're feeling impostery about, we have this expectation that we're supposed to just feel confident. Like, I don't always feel confident. Now, again, imposter syndrome sometimes is a trauma response. Sometimes it's a result of systemic oppression. Sometimes it's a result of things like misogyny in the workplace or whatever. But it's not a syndrome in that there's something wrong with you. It's a signal that there's a need that probably needs to be met. Do you need more affirmation? Do you need relationships that you feel not unconditionally trusted in, but more trusted individuals in your life that you can bounce off of? Do you have people in your life that will be honest with you? The fact that you're still at the job that you're feeling impostery at and that they haven't fired you is a good sign that you're doing better than you think you are. But again, this expectation that we should feel confident in, and this is why I love internal family systems, because this idea that you can have multiplicity within your own mind. You can have parts of you that know that you're killing it, and parts of you that feel like a fraud, and parts of you that feel 5 years old, and parts of you that feel better than everyone, and parts of you that feel worse than everyone. All of that can coexist very peacefully in a single psyche, which is such good news. Otherwise I'd feel very crowded up here.
Yep. And it's too, it's interesting. So I specialize in OCD and do a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy. And so it's a lot of examining the evidence for and against. And so someone with imposter syndrome, like you said, you haven't been fired yet. What is the evidence maybe for the fact that you're not doing a good enough job, but also what is the evidence against it? And I think people too often look for the evidence for the thoughts. But I wonder too, I think we live in a society where people feel pressure to have it all together, to seem like they have it all together, I should say. And in talking to friends, colleagues, clients, it seems like a majority of people have imposter syndrome to some extent. I know that I sometimes have it, and older colleagues, mentors have told me it never really goes away. necessarily. And I wonder your thoughts on how much this unspoken pressure from society to always seem like you have it together makes people feel more alone in these thoughts, and perhaps makes them then feel more stuck because they feel like they're alone in having the imposter syndrome.
Absolutely. It's so easy, especially if you look online, like to feel absolutely. If I spend too much time scrolling on Instagram, I'm just like, why bother? Like, why give up? For everyone who has a PhD, other people, which I don't have, other people have 3, and then for the people who have 3, there are the people that have tenure. For those people, then there's the people that speak 9. I mean, it doesn't ever end. And so I love what you said about this expectation that we shouldn't have it. Therefore, when we have it, we feel like there's something wrong, which keeps us quiet, which keeps us disconnected and isolated. And nothing like doesn't make it go away, but nothing helps make imposter syndrome manageable as much as having people that you love and trust and support in your corner to bounce off of. And the dilemma of I have it, therefore there's something wrong with me, is mitigated when you realize that everyone has it at every level of functioning. They have it to a degree. So great, maybe it's not a syndrome, maybe this is just being human. It's really uncomfortable.
You know, and this next question perhaps feels somewhat ironic given that we're on an Instagram live right now. We connected, via Instagram. And I see someone writing and saying that she's had anxiety her whole life and your book was life-changing. And I know that there were some comments earlier that said very similar thoughts. What role do you think social media has in people feeling stuck in life, in this perpetual comparison? And I know it's a nuanced and complicated topic, and for people it's different, but what role generally do you think it can play, and what are steps, besides perhaps unfollowing people, things that seem really practical, but some people might not want to do that people can take to allow social media to have less of an impact and they're feeling stuck?
It really gets such a, social media is evil. It's the devil. Right. It's the cause of all of the ills of society. I think of social media like any source of fuel. Like fire is really great when it's in a fireplace or when you're roasting marshmallows. Fire is destructive and horrible when it's left uncontained. So like anything else, if you're not willing to limit your screen time, if you're not willing to unfollow people that make you feel bad about yourself, like, okay, if you're not willing to though, at least start observing what is the impact of the accounts that I follow on me. You don't have to do anything differently, but social media has such, I'm like I don't know what year you were born, but I was born in 1980. So like the last analog childhood where there was no, how I wish I could have connected with other people when, like, I get that all of this connectivity is also bad, but social media has such incredible power to normalize, to hasten the process of access. Like there's more accurate, good trauma-informed information on Instagram than you'll find in most licensed therapists' office. Yeah. And therapists aren't required to be trauma-informed. So curate your feed. That's the thing about social media that no one says is you're in charge of everything you see. The algorithm, you have to be careful what you click on because the algorithm is watching, but it's not hard to curate a feed that makes you feel more connected to who you are than disconnected. But it requires a level of honesty of, there are people that I admire that I don't look at their stuff every day because if I look at their stuff too often, I want to quit just doing, like, why bother? Like, I'll never be able to do that. So really paying attention and knowing that there are certain seasons where I need to dial down my use and certain seasons where it's a lifeline to my sanity. Some of my best friends I've met through social media. So I'm not anti, like, what's the impact of choices? And then now that you know this, but what are you willing to do in service of what you want? And not what are you willing to do next week, next month, January 1st? Like, what are you willing to do right now in service of that you want? With social media, maybe it's follow one account intentionally and unfollow one account intentionally or whatever.
And it sounds like too, you're making, several good points, and it sounds like there needs to be some kind of awareness of how does this make me feel as I'm consuming this information, which I think is a really important step because I think people often mindlessly scroll, or they'll be in line in the grocery store and scroll, and then they put it away and they don't take that time to kind of do a mind and body check of how does this make me feel, but also realize that there might be some days or weeks or months where consuming X type of content and X type of accounts is interesting, and there might be some where it's not healthy, and allowing oneself the fluidity and flexibility to be able to change it and not feel like they have to keep following someone because it's a sign of weakness or, you know, something like that, not to. And I think it's a sign of strength and courage to recognize what's good for you and what's not, and to make those changes.
Without the shoulds and the oughts and the musts. Like,
yes.
Even like I follow all the funny, cute little animal accounts, and it's even on, like, I'll go down a rabbit hole on some days where seeing really cute animals just makes me feel worse. I'm just like, great, look at all this adorable, wholesome looking like, I would have loved to have a life where I can just go film squirrels like playing on a basketball net. Like, I hate everyone, and that's not life-giving to me. And other days it's like, oh look, squirrels are cute. So again, it's not what you should be consuming. I'm not here to judge what feels good to your system on any given day, but getting just, again, honest with, what am I consuming? How is it making me feel today? And then, and this is the bummer, what am I willing to do? And if the answer is nothing, fine. I can work with do nothing all day, but what I can't work with is people who say, I'm willing to do everything, but you're not. So let's just not be willing today. Maybe tomorrow we'll be willing to do something different, but it's okay if you're not willing to make changes today. Let's just sit. Like, that is a choice too.
Yeah, I totally agree. And someone wrote into the Instagram live, going back to the conversation about grief that we are having, saying, is it progress that my moments of grief are more intense and don't last as long? You know, I'm curious your thoughts on that.
On the grief process?
So the person said, is it progress that my moments of grief are more intense but don't last as long?
I would say, does it feel like progress? Because I can make a case for, you know, feeling intense grief for a long time is progress. Feeling intense grief for a shorter time is progress. Honestly, the fact that you can access grief and name it as grief at all, I would call progress. I think anywhere where we're willing to feel the discomfort of our humanity, that gets all filed under progress. But yeah, absolutely. Noticing that the grief weight, and I don't think grief is something you get over. It's something that you live with. On certain days, it's harder than others. But if you are able to, I really think mental health is not so much a mindset thing. It's the ability to shift between physiological states without getting stuck for too long in one of them. And if you're able to feel profound grief and then within the same hour, week, month, day, feel something different, that is progress. Anywhere where we're able to the goal of humaning isn't to feel good. Brains aren't designed to be in one steady state. We need to be able to shift. So anywhere where they say in the trauma therapy that I'm trained in, somatic work, a different bad is good. So even if you're feeling a different kind, yuck, if it's a different, it means you're shifting, and shifting is progress, and that's good.
And how then, you know, I think that for some people they feel pressure to push away or get over their negative feelings, and so they might seem to be having a shift because they're not letting that, you know, I could be sad for 5 minutes and then I have to move on, but it's not necessarily moving on. How can people identify whether these shifts in mood are a healthy shift in mood, or if it's really just not being willing to do the processing that needs to be done?
Oh, hi, Jesse. I'm glad you're on here. So that's it. You know, I can't look at someone and know, is your smile because you're avoiding your pain, or is your smile because you're consciously choosing to cope with your pain by putting on a smile? Because the things that are self-care on one day are self-harm on another. So me choosing to let myself feel my grief and my pain and spend all day in my pajamas, like, that is self-care on some days, but that's self-harm on other days. And so it's taking these giant, like, labeling things as all good or all bad and saying, what is this doing for me today? Because again, any self-care behavior can be self-harm if applied improperly. Even things that are, quote, good, like feeling feelings is good, not all the time. Like, you can't feel the feelings all the time. That is just not a reasonable expectation of a human. We have, like, things to do and people to take care of and animals to walk and children to change, or you can't feel your feelings all day, every day and function. So feelings is great, but not always,
Yeah.
right? So sometimes putting a mask on, I'm going to call that awesome that you can do that. And again, it's more, do I feel like I'm in a choice state or a default state? Am I responding or am I reacting? Am I consciously making a choice or am I just flailing about? If it's a choice, then whatever the thing is, you get to do.
Yeah. I think that that's a really good point. And I think too, I don't need to go down a rabbit hole of this, but this, like a wellness culture, I think can be somewhat complicated that sometimes like the idea of wellness gets kind of conflated. Um, and that to what you're saying, that is it a choice I'm making or is it a default, or even does it feel like survival? And that, sometimes survival is necessary, but it's important to feel like you have the agency and the choice to be making. Is that fair to say?
Yes, and it's awful. This is why I joined for a few years, because I didn't want to think. I didn't want to have to be so nuanced and so, I mean, it's hard if you're not taught how to live in your own brain and body. It's really uncomfortable and it's terrifying and it's hard until you learn this stuff, and then it becomes like a muscle that you can develop and exercise. But I'm just like, somebody just tell me what to do, what to think, what to read, and I am good. I am going to bypass the entire process of adulting and just like, I want to be a child forever, please. Thank you. I understand the appeal of not the extreme religious cults like the one I was in, but all manners of, following someone's directive rather than asking yourself, like, fitness, working out is good, but is it on every single? No, it's not. I have an eating disorder. Some days eating a salad is great, but some days eating a cheeseburger is better for my mental. It can't be this binary of good, bad, healthy, unhealthy. Unless you're causing harm to other people, that I'll file. Like, that's a whole different conversation.
Yeah. Someone else wrote in, I feel as though I'm stuck because of my own poor decisions and actions, and now I'm trapped in this shame spiral, stopping me from escaping. How do I break the cycle?
Ah, God, the shame is so real. I get it. I did a lot of drugs and I made a lot of really bad decisions. So it's great that you're taking accountability, because the flip side of, like sitting in self-shame and blame is not helpful, but neither is being like, nope, I have no responsibility for my choices. So I would say often self-blame and self-shame they're not good, but they're sort of a buffer against the change process. As long as I'll speak for myself, not for whoever asked that. I'm the worst person in the entire world. I'm so messed up. I could never. That was actually a shield that I used against the change process. It was easier for a time for me to spin and I suck than to say what I'm willing to do today. Not that that's you. That was me. So one of the fastest ways to get out of the shame spiral, if you're sitting with the reality of your bad decisions, is talk to any other human living an honest life, because they'll tell you, yep, I did some really bad stuff too. And yeah, I feel you. You're not alone. I did that too, is a really great, Brene Brown talks about that. Nothing deactivates shame faster than hearing, yeah, me too. Not to justify it, but to recognize that you may have done bad things, but that's not who you are. And wherever you are and whatever you've done, you can change. Yay, neuroplasticity, that the brains we have are not the brains that we'll have. Yeah. Like, thank God for that.
Yeah. What role do you think, and it depends on the situation, but what role does accountability have, both in holding yourself accountable and having others hold you accountable in situations like this, when you've made bad, what you feel are bad choices and you want to make the change?
I have kind of a controversial hot take on accountability.
Yeah, I'd love to hear about it.
I'm not anti-accountability. So again, like, everyone do you. If you like having an accountability partner tell you what to do and checking in on you, like, awesome. I'm not saying you can't. I'm saying my take on accountability is it becomes, I don't think people mean to do this, but I've seen it happen in the addiction recovery world. I've seen it in the like super wellnessy world. I've seen it in the fitness world. I've seen it in the religious world, where the idea of accountability then becomes someone parent me. I want someone to be my mom or dad and tell me what to do. I don't think accountability is an external process. I think accountability is a purely internal process. We need people to walk beside us. It's helpful for me to have friends, and I do, who I'll say, so I can keep myself accountable. Is it okay if I call you to let you know that I did X or didn't do whatever? That's fine. But this idea that someone else can hold us accountable is a way of outsourcing our power and creating a parent-child dynamic where even if you're compliant with the behavior, you don't get any of the credit. That's why when people say, and I'm sure you get this too, as a therapist, I don't take credit for their wins and I don't take responsibility for their, challenges. It's like we want to walk beside each other. Accountability people, the way it's often done is a power differential where I'm going to tell, and I've had 12-step sponsors who really took this accountability thing and ran with it to their job is to tell me what to do and to shame me and yell at me if I'm not doing it. So I think accountability is an inside job that we can ask for side-by-side support to help execute. But I don't think anyone can hold us accountable.
No, and I think it's so important. As I'm sure you have had clients say, you're the reason for the change that I've seen. And I tell people, I see you for an hour a week. You're with yourself 24/7. We can talk about things, we can make plans for things, we can process things, but 1 hour a week is not enough to make the change. And, I also subscribe to the idea that in most cases, the goal of therapy is to become one's own therapist. And to provide someone with tools and insight and confidence to be able to do that. And that, when people start saying to me, oh, can we do, bi-weekly check-ins, monthly check-ins, quarterly check-ins just to hold me accountable, the question becomes, why do I need to be able to do that? What are the steps you can take to be able to do that for yourself? And it's empowering when you can do it for yourself and not feel like you have to be doing it to make someone proud or to show someone that you can do it. That being able to make yourself proud.
That one's a right? Because if you didn't get it, you don't get it. Like if you didn't get it as a child, the I'm proud of you is such a dice. And again, I'm not gatekeeping the term. If you told people that you're proud of them, that's not a problem. I have been very careful not to tell people that I'm proud of them because, again, it creates this power imbalance. So whether it's a client or someone I know that's like, I need you to hold me accountable. No, you don't, because you are an adult person. Be here to support. I'll captain your cheerleading squad. I will be with you every step of the way, but no, I won't hold you accountable because you can do that. Like for me to hold you accountable is in fact disempowering because I'm telling you that you can't, and I won't do that.
Someone wrote into the chat asking why people make bad decisions during a traumatic experience, such as a divorce or other grief. For example, toxic relationships, drinking, or drugs.
I so get that. We make bad decisions when we're in trauma because it feels bad to be in trauma, and until it doesn't, it feels good to be high or numb or dissociated or disconnected or in any way not feeling the thing that we're feeling. Like it feels better to feel bad being altered than to feel bad being with ourselves. And I get that. And we have to recognize that, again, it's not about me saying, no problem, do whatever you want. It's all coping, like all numbing, coping, like drinking, drugs, shopping, eat, whatever your thing is. All of those things are not a sign that you suck as a person. They're signs that there's an injury that needs tending. And in the IFS model, the goal is not to like banish your inner critic or banish the parts of you that use addiction. It's to help unburden them so they don't have to do that job. Like that's a crappy job. So we don't want your parts having to protect you from pain in that way. The goal of that type of therapy is to recognize that there is a capable center of the storm that can tolerate the pain and find the resources and do what needs to be done to, but there are certain times where you don't have the safety necessary to feel your feelings. And that's a really important one. Like when someone is in an oppressive or threatening environment, that's not the time to think about your thought life or try a coping skill. Like safety has to trump everything.
A broader question that feels present on, so many levels these days that someone wrote in is, how do you find hope in a situation that feels hopeless?
So, I mean, if we're talking about war, that's going to be a lot different than
Right.
if we're talking about an abusive
Yeah.
situation. If we're talking about the hope for humanity, different conversation than hope that my loved one quits using
Right.
cocaine.
Yeah.
So I will say, I'm not talking about the political sphere. I'm not talking about the human condition. I'm talking on a very individualized level. My disclaimer.
Yes.
Sometimes hopelessness is the medicine. And I'll speak for myself. When I was in a series of very dysfunctional, violent relationships, one of the things that kept me stuck is maybe this time, maybe this time, maybe this time.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that I have no hope for humanity. It just means that situation wasn't getting better. And as long as I held on to hope that it could, I would stay stuck. This is not going to change and the situation is hopeless sounds really dark and nihilistic and pessimistic and negative, but it's not. That was the key that unlocked the cage.
Yeah. I wonder, like related to that, I've seen so many situations, whether it be, you know, I I think a lot of the ones that stand out to me right now are emotional abuse. Um, but it can be any abuse or it doesn't have to be abuse, just like any unhealthy situation. There's often a pattern in which people want the other person to be able to redeem themselves. Um, and and I think, I don't know the circumstance in which this person wrote in this question, but that, like, to your point, acknowledging that something won't change is not being hopeless, but it's maybe acknowledging the key that will then help you move on from it or figure out the steps to start moving on.
Yeah.
Does that seem fair to
It
say?
is fair. The expression doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is the definition of insanity. It's like, no, it's not. That's the definition of trauma repetition. And that's how our brains are designed to repeat over and over and over and over, hoping to get a different outcome. And so that's why you see people teeing up the same habits year after year, teeing up
Yeah.
the same relationship patterns. It's not because you're crazy or broken, it's because your brain likes patterns and it wants an outcome that it's not going to get. And for me, accepting the futility, the things that I didn't get in childhood, I'm not going to ever get, like maybe in some other iteration of consciousness, but like in this lifetime, in this organism that I live in, I don't get a redo at my inner child is always with me and I love inner child work, but my chronological childhood has come and it has gone and I don't get to go back. And so trying to recreate those things tends to add up to a big chaotic mess.
Yeah.
So hope is a tricky thing because sometimes hopelessness is reality and sometimes that's the medicine for a toxic situation. Now, if you're looking at the geopolitical sphere right now in particular and feeling hopeless, that's a different story. That's a question of what you're looking at is so big, you're not going to fix it, but is there an action you can take right now that would allow you to feel a sense of choice? Because the opposite of trauma is choice, because if we could choose, we would choose not to be traumatized. So anywhere we're able to make a choice to be of service, to help, to ask for help if we need it, to give it if we're able, we're not going to feel good about what's going on, but you're going to be in your choice power, which is a better place to be.
And I think too, knowing that you have the choice of what you want to consume and what you don't want to. Is that fair to add into that it's there are steps you can take and people you can reach out to, but also giving yourself the grace to say this is enough for me right now and not feel bad about that.
Which I get, like how lovely, what a place of privilege it is to
Yeah.
turn off our phones and
Yes.
not be in
Yes.
situation. I get that, and the perspective on safety, privilege, access, that's important to hold that perspective. But you forcing yourself to watch hours
Yeah.
and hours and hours and hours of content does not solve the problems that
Right.
you're not of service to anybody if your nervous system is fried and like locked down in a state of freeze. So it's not about turn off your phone and numb out to the realities of the world. It's know what you need to know so you're an informed person, and then ask yourself, what are my choices? Because I'm not doing anybody any good by just consuming content. It's great to be informed, but now what can I do with what I now know? And that doesn't mean that you have to wear yourself out trying to do all of the things. Our brains were not designed to know all of the things, nor were they designed to do all of the things.
Right.
We're designed to know and do what we can know and do, and that's it. And so that's, again, accepting the limits and futility of being human. Means you can't be of service to every person in every topic on every plane at the same intensity simultaneously. Like, don't do that.
Yeah. Such a good point. Where can people consume more of your content? People have read your book, they love your work, you're changing lives and giving people really important perspectives. Where else, besides following you on Instagram, where else can they consume your work?
Thank you. And don't consume myself if you get to a point where you're like, I'm tired of hearing about trauma and the nervous, like, great, turn that off and then go watch like sea otters hugging each other on one of my favorites. It's so cute. I love sea otter videos. So I'm on Instagram all the time. I don't have a team managing me. Like, I'm here. I write the things. I say hi to everyone who DMs me. So I really, really love it as a platform of connecting people that would never be able to connect otherwise. So find me here. The book is wherever books do book things. And the workbook for Science of Stuck will be out in June of next year. So I'm really excited. That'll be available soon, but yeah, it'll be out in June. And I'm around. So come find me and come say hi.
And one question I like to ask all of the speakers for the book club is, what is either something you're reading right now or something you've read recently that you would recommend that other people?
I'll show you. I am oops, sorry, Oscar Bear. I'm like super into this book right now. Become What You Are, Alan Watts.
Okay. And what is a summary for people who might be interested in it?
Yeah, I'll read a little snippet from the back because it's so good. Life exists only at this very moment. And in this moment, it is infinite and eternal. For the present moment is infinitely small. Before we can measure it, it is gone. And yet it exists forever. You may believe yourself out of harmony with life and it's eternal now, but you cannot be, for you are life and exist now. It's so good.
Sounds very good. Thank you so much for coming to speak to the book club. Like I said, the book is really, really powerful. And so many people wrote in saying, thanking me for reaching out to you. And, thank you for the work that you do, because as I'm sure you know, it really impacts a lot of people.
Thank you so much. I love doing things like this. Thank you, everybody who joins. Thank you, Shelly, Marie, and Tim, and everybody else that's here. And Katie, hi. So I love doing things like this. Thank you so much for having me on.
No, thank you. Have a good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.